it's something that we can't just ignore. Just because there's this movement of reconciliation does not mean we've done enough. You have to keep listening. You have to be aware.
Part of the research, the results of the research that we're looking at, is highlighting that there's a thread through all of these things, that the issues that individuals are experiencing are related to the issues that employers are experiencing, that are related to the issues that the government-funded agencies are experiencing.
Meeting people where they're at is huge. We can ask things of people and assess if they're ready for that. If they're not, then we come to you. we take what you have to give.
Yes.
And build from there, because I think that there's always room to build.
From Free Reign Associates and Life Strategies, this is the Diversity Disconnect podcast. I'm Mallory Tomlinson. Episode 6, So What Now? Over the past 5 episodes, we've examined the 20 success factors that impact the workplace success of underrepresented individuals. Through this, you've heard the stories of our research participants through the voices of Jordan, Shane, George, and Alex, and how these factors have impacted their lives. And you've been asked to consider how these factors influence your workplaces and your role in the work field. By now, you might be wondering how you can use this information to build stronger communities, successful workplaces, and empower people for success. Today, I'm joined by Cassie Taylor, Madeleine Warkentin, and Emily White, our researchers from the Diversity Disconnect Project. In our conversation, we explore considerations for creating safe and accessible spaces, dive into the continued importance of recognizing what you don't know, and uncover how to begin to create change within our systems with intentionality. Hello again, Cassie, Madeleine, and Emily.
Hello.
Hello.
So after 5-ish months of talking with folks in these communities and gathering data, how did you even begin to start to process it, organize it, and start to put together some recommendations?
All right, we had quite the process. It was, so during our interview process, we took a lot of notes and recorded these interviews just for our purposes. We began to sort of roughly transcribe the audio from that and take our notes all together. And from there, we began pulling out themes and categories from these interviews to start kind of shaping the landscape of what we were working with.
Yeah, and within that framework, we had several credibility checks during our interviews, speaking with our interviewees, making sure that we rephrased what we were hearing from them to, in the moment, make sure that we kind of had the right idea. And then from there, when we had our notes organized into our ECIT framework, sending that to the participant and verifying that we were kind of on the right track there. And then once we worked together to pull out our themes and categories, we did that through working as a team with Post-its and a lot of wall space to kind of see where exactly they fit and where all of those factors were interacting with each other. And once we had those, what ended up being 20 main themes, we then sent those back to our participants again to ask, have we kind of encapsulated the general idea of what you've shared? Is there anything that we're missing, anything that has been worded inappropriately? And we had the standard at this point of no news is good news, but the news that we did hear was that it was fantastic. Everybody was quite pleased and impressed with what they had shared and how it all shaped up.
Yeah, so what Emily and Madeleine are describing is a really collaborative, dynamic process to research. And the ECIT, the Enhanced Critical Incident Technique, is really asking research participants to identify things that helped, things that hindered, and a variety of wish list items. So there was quite a lot of information that we got from participants, and those included individuals, they included people who had a job or were job seeking, included employers and service providers as well. So lots of different perspectives. And even with all of those things that we were looking at, we were able to come up with quite the list of things that helped or hindered. And so the success factors really look at something from both perspectives. When the success factor is present, it helps. When it isn't present, it hinders people to be successful in their employment journeys. And I still remember that day we were all together with all the Post-its. And so we took all of those notes and transcripts that Emily and Madeleine had compiled for us and had participants provide their input on. We looked at all of those and identified some commonalities or patterns that we're seeing, and then those were kind of put up for a discussion. And we had to be mindful as we were pulling these together that we were capturing perspectives from across the different kinds of participants that were giving us information, but also that any category was reaching this critical mass of 25% of participants. And it was sort of tracking it with like ticky marks and things like that as we go along. But we got this interesting picture and, moving things around as they fit here or fit there. And we came to those 20 categories. And then we worked on capturing a bit of a description that presented the full scope of what this category was, and then putting that back out to participants. And so it was dynamic and ongoing and collaborative as well. We also had a survey that we ran that had a variety of different questions. So we did a bit of some statistical analysis on that as well, looking at differences between groups, like were the perspectives of individuals different than the perspectives of employers, or different from the perspectives of job seekers, right? And so that was a really unique space where we could go and look at the disconnects that maybe were present in opinions.
What were some of the initial disconnects between employers and underrepresented workers that stood out to you?
So one of the disconnects that jumped out to me was really the employer's perception that they were providing a space that was really inclusive, that they were able to meet the cultural and accommodation needs of the staff that they had hired. And to some extent, the individuals who were currently employed, so people who were employed, did indicate an agreement with that statement. They tended to agree, maybe not as much as the employer, but the job seekers did not agree that employers in their area were able to successfully balance employment realities and the very real necessity of accommodation or cultural needs within the organization. So there was a bit of a question for me that came out of that, which is sometimes what happens with survey data. You just get at more questions that come out of it. What is it about the people who were currently employed, because they did represent underrepresented groups? What was it that facilitated their successes versus the job seekers? And how were employers looking at what an inclusive workplace even was? Because job seekers did not agree with employers in this stretch.
I think building off of that through the lens of interviews that Emily and I went through and conducted, was employers were saying to us, there were several who said, "Oh, I don't hire like that," when asked, really just when the subject of underrepresented groups was broached. They would say, "Well, I don't hire like that. I will hire the most equipped, skilled candidate for the job that I'm trying to fill." But when you look at wider statistics and when you look at their workplaces, they don't reflect diversity or underrepresented groups in a way that you would expect if that were the case. As well as they can say that they would hire whoever is best equipped to do the job, but when asked if they feel equipped to deal with or accommodate access needs, I got the question back, well, what constitutes as an access need? So there's a disconnect there between what they might be under the impression is happening, and they believe that they're giving everybody an equal chance, but when asked in what ways they are giving everybody an equal chance, they don't really have an answer for that.
Yeah. both of these things that have been brought up have really stuck with me, but I think the thing that stuck with me the most was the lack of acknowledgement of issues faced by the Indigenous communities. We had unfortunately, quite a few folks who were in different spaces, such as service providers, employers, what have you, mentioned that, like, yeah, okay, they're like, these people are looking for support, but it's not because they're Indigenous. And that is so disheartening to me, because when we spoke with people from these communities and groups, they had so many things to share of like the barriers they're facing on the daily because they are Indigenous. Mm-hmm. And it's something that we can't just ignore. Just because there's this movement of reconciliation does not mean we've done enough. You have to keep listening. You have to be aware. There are things there.
Yeah, like I've heard this. This isn't my point, but I've heard there is no reconciliation without truth.
Exactly.
Truth comes first, and it's in that statement for a reason. Mm-hmm. And I think that sort of really touched on the whole awareness piece of a lot of the research. You know, employers thought they were doing the right thing, but they're actually not being truthful with themselves, or they're not being truthful with like the context that exists.
Yeah, reconciliation is an action. As much as people want to just coin the phrase of reconciliation, like, you have to mean it. You have to actually do something about it. And that can just be listening. That does not mean you have to like do things. Listening is an action. It may feel passive, but you are doing a world of service to these communities just by hearing them out. And yeah, I don't know.
And I think active listening, and listening not to reply, but listening to hear.
Yeah.
And action that, right? Like, what are you going to do with what's been told to you? You can either say, no, that's not true, or be like, oh, that's true for you.
I validate that. I hear you.
I hear you, right? Yeah. I think a lot of people get into the weeds of arguing the particulars about, what happened or didn't happen. And I almost think it doesn't matter. Like, I'm not a historical expert. I wasn't there. All I know is a bunch of people are telling me very loudly that this is what happened and this is how it feels. And if I put myself in their shoes with what they say, that's not a good time. And that has implications over generations. Like, it's not something that happened in the distant past. Like, we are talking about, what was it, in the 80s, 90s? 96. Like, that's ridiculous, right? And I think people try to argue around it. It's in the past. I'm like, that is kind of irrelevant to me, right? That's irrelevant to me. You're telling me that this did you harm? I should just accept that at face value.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it comes back to that trauma-informed approach too. It's very clearly lacking, and that is something we noted along the way, right? Whether it was the Indigenous groups or those with disabling conditions, it's not recognizing that there is long-lasting, like, deep-seated trauma within these groups, and we can't go forward if we're not going to acknowledge that. If we're going to just pretend like, oh, like, la-di-da, they just have issues because of themselves, or they just have issues that they need to deal with on their own that I can't help with. It's not fair. It's not going to do anything at all. Yeah.
We're still sitting on land that isn't ours. Like, BC has no treaties.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we haven't, from a macro, we in BC haven't done the work that even other provinces have done to settle land claims.
Yeah. And like, I think too, like, Indigenous communities have so much to say. It's not like they're being quiet.
No.
That the focus group we did in an Indigenous community was the most powerful one. And that was just a small group of, what was it, like 6 or 8 or something? 8. And so, like, as a collective, there's so much to be said. And we're not listening appropriately. We're really not. And that's only evident in people saying that these people don't have issues because they're Indigenous. Like, how is that fair to say? We're in 2024. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
What can you do from that?
Well, even the diversity in Indigenous populations as well. Like, we spoke to someone who came from an Indigenous group, and he fully recognized that his experience with trauma was very different than that of his father's too. That's only 2 generations, and both of those generations are of working age.
Yeah.
Like, these are people who are in our workforce. This is not someone's grandfather. Like, these are parents.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the time because we're in a stressed system of we need people to work. We have gaps that need to be filled. I think there's a tendency to look at what is directly in front of you, and to say, well, this is an issue. I've noticed that these kinds of people are lazy, or I've noticed this repeated problem. It applies to Indigenous people and people with disabling conditions. I keep seeing this over and over. And so I'm jaded, or I don't feel comfortable engaging with these groups when they're not willing to do the work and look a little bit deeper. Like it is really right in front of you if you're looking. And I think that there has been a lack of willingness to see, and just a lack of awareness that is quite prevalent. And so if there could be just an attitude of learning and hearing, I think that would go a long way.
Respondents spoke to a frustrating cycle in the workforce. Employers face high turnover rates, which impacts the bottom line of their business. Individuals feel like they are cycling on and off income assistance or bounding around community service programs. The bureaucracy of navigating the supports disincentivizes employers from seeking things such as wage subsidies. How does this cycle create further barriers to inclusive employment? What misconceptions might arise from not understanding the nuances of these systems?
There's a lot of issues, right? And each party is really hyper-focused on the issues that are existing for them. So for individuals, balancing their need for employment with being able to access the funding for services that they need, right? For workplaces, it's hiring and keeping a good workforce. And for government agencies, it's, not having this spin cycle of people like actually having good outcomes in terms of long-term sustainable employment. And so those are all really big issues for each of the 3 separate parties. And so it's really easy for each of those groups to just focus in on the issue that they have in hand. But I think part of the research, the results of the research that we're looking at, is highlighting that there's a thread through all of these things, that the issues that individuals are experiencing are related to the issues that employers are experiencing, that are related to the issues that the government-funded agencies are experiencing. And so when we take that real narrow, siloed focus at what the actual problem is right in front of my face, and we don't step back to consider the full context of where this system has created the problems that are common for all of us, we aren't actually grappling with the issue in a meaningful, large-scale way. And when bureaucracy is broken, we need large-scale systems changes to address that kind of thing. Unfortunately, the people who cycle through, the people who feel it the most, are those individuals. And it was interesting that the word cycle, I think only 2 people shared.
Yeah, it didn't come up very often, that's for sure.
But they certainly were describing the experience of being through a cycle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think just to provide an example for that, in our interviews, we had folks talking about how they were in a college program, and for them, most of the time, it seemed like the better option for them to simply stay on the social assistance rather than seeking out that education, because while they were on that education, they weren't able to get paid to provide for their families. And then when they did get their certificates, it wasn't a guarantee that employers were even going to see that as useful to them. And so a lot of the times they were completing this with not really seeing a benefit. And so there's just a lot of what Cassie was mentioning, the threads of things kind of being interconnected, but in a way that's not working.
Absolutely. I think the way that I can speak to this from what I know of my own personal experience, also speaking with service providers, is when people are receiving social assistance, they are put in a position of systemic poverty. The living amount is not enough that they can not work, but they are also in a position where they can't work enough. So they will make too much while on income assistance. So it becomes a situation where rather than doing work that fits into their skill sets and their interests, they're in a position where it just makes more sense to be at home rather than facing the barriers that exist once they've passed their threshold, their door. It is so defeating that you're just, I'm in a cycle of systemic poverty, but that's kind of the best I can do.
Like the best of the bad options.
The best of the bad options available to me.
Yeah.
And so it prevents people from achieving their full potential.
Yeah. And if the government's goal is to get people off of income assistance, wouldn't they want to enable people to be able to access some services and supports while they're building their skills in a manageable way that isn't going to put them at risk for, furthering their conditions? Like it when you step back, it's like, oh, well, that makes sense. But it's challenging in the moment because there has to be some level, there has to be some constraint, and that, intellectually I can understand. But when we're not actually looking at the outcome, the impact of those services and the bureaucracy that exists there, we're not really talking about the same thing. Like, even I think about, after you have children and you think about returning to the workforce, like, yes, it's great that you can get, a year of coverage with income assistance. But then if you want to go back to work, generally speaking, the kids need to go into daycare. Well, that's crazy expensive. Or like you'd be working just to pay your daycare expenses. And so these sort of frustrations in the bureaucracy exist across the board. But, people who have been repeatedly excluded from employment opportunities haven't been able to establish a base level that someone else necessarily has been able to do. And it's almost like the system is created to keep you there. And that's a frustrating thing to grapple with too.
Yeah, we had one individual in particular who really spoke to like the hoop jumping needed just to get to systems and like acquire these supports. And for her, it was simply just trying to get to school. She had troubles with even just getting transportation to school, even though on reserve they were offering it. That was a trouble. She wasn't even sure how she was being funded for school. They didn't tell her what the process was. They kept telling her to go to different parts of like the band office to talk to different people. And like at that point, she's like, I'm just here. I'm trying to just get it done. I don't know if it's even being paid for, but I'm here. And so if she is struggling like that, like just imagine the amount of other things going on behind the scenes that people are just like, they just want to go forward with their life. They want to gain these new skills. They want to do these things, but they can't. The systems are telling them, no, it's easier to be on social assistance because that's just the system that's in place. That's easier.
If you talk about motivation, right? When employers say, oh, these kind of populations aren't motivated, it's like, well, wait now. Like if you examine their everyday life just to like function or access training or to do all the things that you take for granted, they have to be so motivated and persistent and connected and all of those things. What are you talking about? They're not motivated.
Yeah. And I think at a certain point too, people just don't have the capacity at a certain point because all of their motivation is going into these other things. So once they reach that certain point, that motivation can't be seen because it is being placed into all these other areas of their life, right?
What I was going to say is that it's easier, but you're still to stay on assistance, but you're still suffering. Like you're not enjoying your life.
Yeah, like it's not to say that
It's
these
not
things are
fun.
easy. Yeah, they're not easy or fun. It's still a process.
Like the process is so frustrating, but the outcome is still poor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's aggravating for me to hear it too. Like it's annoying enough for me to like have to get on the phone with customer service and find my way through to a person. Like that's annoying enough for me. Imagine if you're balancing like government funding from multiple agencies, right? Maybe you've got an educational institution you're working with, disability services, maybe some sort of outreach in your community. And for all of those systems, you're going through this crazy making maze. It's complicated and challenging and unfair.
Yeah.
And you're so tired.
Yeah, it comes back to the capacity, right?
There's a limit of capacity, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that capacity is not just a measure of your internal characteristics, right? Capacity is a measure of the external resources that are available to you, or your ability to make use of those resources. Like a program's great, but if no one can access it, tree falls in the woods. Does anybody hear it, right?
Yeah.
So that's, again, the aggravation that participants really spoke to.
For so long, there's been an almost romanticized view by those who are outside of underrepresented groups in their approach to inclusive hiring and creating safe workspaces. It's difficult to understand and recognize the realities of underrepresented groups when you don't share that experience. We saw this in the data, for example. You reported that 49% of job seekers agreed that the staff of the workplaces in their area represent the diversity of their community compared to 82% of employers. So you encourage everyone to get real about the factors that impact individuals, workplaces, and communities using a holistic, system-based exploration of everyone's experiences. Where can listeners start to do this? How do people take this new understanding, this realistic view to inclusive employment, and apply it to their everyday life?
Part of it is trying to draw people out of that unconscious incompetence, right? And I truly believe employers think that they're doing the best, that they are being inclusive. Like when they tell me that they think they're inclusive, I believe they think they're inclusive and maybe have an authentic desire to do that and are motivated to do that. They spoke to us. They've got to think that they're doing something great. But in the nuts and bolts of it all, it's way more messy than on the surface. And I think, being curious and asking questions and inviting representatives from those kinds of populations to help inform you or to analyze what's going on within your workplace is a first step, and not holding too tightly to the things that you have done just because you've done them in the past. And that is sort of like a good business sense thing as well.
Yeah, I think that's important. Like the curiosity, using that word to approach it, I think is a really important one because it kind of keeps people in the space of like being humble and coming at it from a space that's not being defensive or combative right off the bat. It's opening that space for people to feel like they're not going to be in an immediate like backlash the second they respond. Yeah, I think that's a good place to start for sure.
Absolutely. I'm so aware of there is so much that people don't know, particularly people. To say it again, you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know what you haven't had to interact with, or experience closely. Like in my own life, there's people that have known me my whole life. And I'm just getting into spaces where people have no context of a physically disabled person. And so being in the face of somebody who really does have no context, there is an element of patience and grace that has to be extended. I never want to come at something with anger or hostility, because that is not helpful. I understand where those feelings come from, and I've felt the desperation and the frustration of just hear me and see my people. And so extending that grace when possible to say, if you're interested, if you are open enough to hear me, then that is a great start. Hear me, and we can kind of work towards a solution that works for everybody, but just hear me and be open.
we gotta start with it, right? We gotta start with a common place. And, that doesn't necessarily, we're not trying to point the fingers at people here, but like, we can't improve if we all don't talk about, the elephant in the room, so to speak, right? And I think employers need to feel a little more comfortable in these uncomfortable conversations and, feel okay with imperfect temporary solutions, right? Or being, I don't have an answer for that. I'm going to go figure it out and I'm going to come back to you, right? Because we can't always assume or put the burden on whoever represents that population to come up with answers. I mean, chances are they've already grappled with this issue and they have a good answer, but you also need to do the work as an employer as well. And part of that is going to be existing in an uncomfortable space. Like whenever anybody grows their skills, whether they're an individual, an employer, a community service provider, like it requires you to put yourself in an uncomfortable space. And in some instances, you're going to want to be invited into that space. And I think that invitation is really important. And I think people from underrepresented populations can tell when you're just doing it for the number, or you're just doing it for, to put that you're an inclusive employer. But to really like walk your talk is a process and it's ongoing. It's not like a one-time thing. And that's kind of where we have to start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, sorry, Madeleine, I know you have something brewing. I think it's important for people to realize that the more you're feeling comfortable in situations, the more you're not challenging yourself to like grow beyond what you know. So I think it's good to feel uncomfortable, right? Like it doesn't feel nice in the moment to like be called out for something or whatever.
We ask our individuals we're employing all the time to be uncomfortable and work on skill development and focus on all sorts of things. We ask that of individuals all the time.
Yeah.
But we have to ask that of ourselves too.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. That's totally it.
The other thing it clicked early in this conversation, but representation is hugely important, and we're not used to, I think in the landscape of employment services and employers in general, we're getting used to the idea of seeing people who are diverse in these spaces. And it's new, but I think it is so important to have people who represent that diversity at the helm and have them visible, because isolation is the number. I mean, there's no stats attached to this, but like it just keeps coming up in underrepresented groups. If you're not visible, where is the change going to happen? And so finding opportunities to let people from diverse groups speak for themselves and speak for their communities, that is such a new concept. We've often had spokespeople that know us speaking for us. And I think a lot of that is because advocacy is exhausting. So there definitely is a place for allyship and help from our trusted people. But I think seeing people who look different from us and hearing them is going to be so important for getting the standard sorted of how to move forward.
Hear, hear.
Yeah.
Representation in organizations is really important. And I think a further conversation is where that representation falls, right? Like whether it's entry level, middle management, upper management, strategic planning and stuff like that. And likely you're not going to find representatives from underrepresented groups who are ready to jump in at the high levels. Not a skill-based issue, but just an environmental fit issue. Like the workplace is not shifted to create an environment that's going to be ready to accept, that shift. Workplaces need to invest in early development and give people training and invest in them to build them through into leadership positions. Because now, like big corporations, I know it's not rural and remote, but big corporations are looking for representation at senior leadership. But they look around and there's no one on their leadership team that they can promote into the senior leadership position. And it's like, yeah, that's the point, right? So you gotta build those skills through, or you gotta port in from other industries who have maybe done a better job with representation, and then build the industry specific skills there.
Okay. Your report encourages folks to make it personal. What does this look like, and why is it important to personalize this issue, even or especially if you aren't a member of an underrepresented group?
That's a really good question.
Well, right off the bat, I'll say if you're not a member of an underrepresented group, you know people who are, and you're close with people who are, even if you're not aware of it. That's just the truth. So I have to think on expanding that, but you have a vested interest in this because you know people who need this help.
I think that's what makes it sticky, right? That's what we're hoping to personalize it. That's what we're hoping will make it sticky for employers in particular, in terms of finding solutions that are a little bit more innovative and more inclusive and inviting in different perspectives. If you're told to do it, it's not going to be successful. Like you have to find a way to make it make sense for your particular context, for the people that you know in your community, right? Unless it's personal, it's not going to stick.
Yeah, and I think that just speaks to the research itself, right? Like, even for myself and Madeleine, like we have shared experience with the people we spoke with. And even then, hearing their stories has been hugely powerful for us. Like I carry the weight of these stories with me every single day now. Like there's not an instance or day that goes by where I don't think about these people and the short stories they have shared with us. And like, all I want is to provide them with everything that I can, right? And I can only do so much. And so if we can all kind of go forward with that weight and that like feeling that fire of just wanting to see change, right? And like knowing that these people are out there, we only spoke with like, say, a handful of folks from each community, but there are so many more where that came from. And so I think the more we can just like open it up to being a personal thing. It's not this like, oh, well, that's just in a book, or that I saw that on TV. It's like, these people, they exist. They are in your community. They probably walk past your store every day, right? Knowing that these people are out there, I think just fuels the ability for us to just have empathy. Like I like to believe we all have a good heart, right? And yeah, I think it's just like the thing that's gonna really just push things forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything to add, Madeleine?
No, just all of our people live within me too. I sit and I think about them, and I try to ponder and work out anything that I know of, like resources I may know, things that I could offer them. And I really hope that there are other people that once they're aware can kind of take that on as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think it should the onus should be on us who have shared experience, just because we know a little bit of what it's like. I think if everybody can share a little bit of that, how far could we get?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you guys really speak so eloquently to like the impact that the stories that participants have shared with you. And I think you're good stewards of research in your desire to share those stories and ignite a passion for other people. And know when I hear you speak about their stories, I feel that. And I hope that when people listen to the stories that we're sharing here and on the resources that we've developed, that they'll feel that too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, it's just important that like, I feel so honored that these people felt like comfortable and safe with us to share these stories, because they are like, they're uncomfortable, right? Like, it's not easy for people to share these things. And like, we get to be the bearer of these incredible, powerful, emotional stories. And the more we can open up the space for that to happen, the more that we can like grow as a collective to really just let these people in and like give that big group hug of like, I've got you, we've got your back.
Yeah, it's fostering that sense of safety that I think we were able to hit kind of a sweet spot on. I don't necessarily know all of the things that contributed to that for us. It was kind of a magical culmination of situations and circumstances. But there's a sense of safety that I think needs to be part of this, for people to feel that they can share and their stories need to be heard. So however we can kind of work towards creating that safety is hugely important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then one last thing from me. I should say that like it was not difficult for us to gain the trust of these people and to like get to know them, right? So it's not a difficult thing. You have to just like, I think our key to success was just being authentic with them and not coming at it as like, I'm corporate researcher, right? Like come at it like, yeah, like I am a real person. I understand. And when I don't understand, like I am there to learn and there to grow, right? Mm-hmm. Like you just have to be open to it and just be there, be ready to listen, be ready to hear. And sometimes it's okay to not say anything for once, right? Like it's not always your responsibility. Sometimes you're just there to listen.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate how hopeful of approach you guys have come out of this with, because I know that a lot of the stories were heartbreaking, you know, and frustrating, and know that like we heard that, we got that message. And I do think that taking a strength-based, hopeful approach is the option, right? Like is how we can create change and enact change. And just like the collection of skills that you guys used to gather stories from participants, those are all skills that we can invite our employer partners to like utilize as well. You know, being authentic and genuine, listening more. I think that those are approaches that they can really take with them.
How can members of underrepresented groups also use this work to reflect on the role they play in the disconnect between the influencing groups?
I don't want to say that people need to absolutely share their story, because sometimes it's just not a comfortable thing. And I don't think it's fair to put the onus on them to do that. But I think, again, it's just making it personal and like showing up and being there. And again, people are showing up and being there. It's just, I don't know, keep the good fight going, stay persistent. And I know the capacity is limited, but people are there for you. Like stay hopeful, keep looking. I don't know.
We did see that, right? Like one really sad story shared early on in the process was bookended with success at the end. And it, you know, that was really heartwarming to me. So you're right. Stay the course.
Yeah.
As hard as it can be when you're in it, and in the reality and sometimes the dark depths of it all, if you can just not have your heart hardened, and trust that there is going to be somebody. And in the way that we did snowball recruitment, and things there was one positive movement led to another and another. If you can find your one person and just keep sharing who you are authentically, and what that looks like, and being as open as you are safe to be, there's going to be somebody that sees it. And then from there, you hope that leads to more, and then to change.
So I have two thoughts. So one is on that career development is messy at the best of times, right? So for people who are highly skilled, like I've worked with like postdoctoral students, right? Or postdoctoral fellows. These are super, super educated people who are grappling with the same issues that underrepresented groups are. They can't find employment in their local areas. Yes, they have more flexibility to move around, but there's just such high competition for the kinds of jobs that they want. Or, tenure track positions are just phasing out, that's not as common to find those kind of opportunities. And so they're reevaluating where they are. And so across skill levels, across capacity levels, career development can be messy sometimes. And so that's important to really normalize that process for people who are from underrepresented groups. It's more challenging for people from those groups, but it can always be messy. And so I would just really want to normalize that process for them. Another piece is sustainable matches will come with fit, right? I know the desire to just get a paycheck or, needing income and like a survival job, like that's a driving factor, and I'm not discounting that. But don't stop your job search. If you've got something that's going to pay you cash, maybe tips or something like that, great. Don't stop looking, because that might not be the best fit for you. If you find a job site or an employer who fits for you, you'll have more sustainable employment in the long term. And so concurrently working those things together is important to consider as well. And, if you can't find fit, make it, right? Self-employment is a really great option as well. And so don't discount that opportunity for yourself as well, because we haven't talked a lot about self-employment, but it is a viable employment option in today's marketplace. And so consider all options in front of you.
What role does monitoring and evaluating one's efforts play in success regarding inclusive employment? What are the harms of not implementing this step in the process?
So for me, the first thing that comes to mind is, because I have a background in kinesiology, and so I know for a lot of patients, it was really difficult to see that they were making progress in their healing journey when they weren't reflecting on where they started. So even if that's, say, being able to walk up the stairs without holding onto the railing or taking a break halfway through, that's still a piece of progress. And so I think it applies to this process as well. If you're not taking a step back and looking at where you came from to now, it can get really disheartening and feel like you're not, you're just treading water, you're not going forward. And it's hard to see that there's going to be the swells and the peaks. And so it's hard to see the horizon, right? If you're riding that wave, it's hard to see the horizon if you're not taking that moment to check in from where you came from and the effort that you've put in.
Yeah, a moment of appreciation is hugely helpful. And it's also has that effect of being able to boost your motivation and resilience. Also, I think in the realm of where employers and service providers come in, thinking of similar to how I would view my own values, making sure you kind of have a clear idea of your goals and where you're going and what you're trying to achieve, and making sure that, because it is easy to kind of get lost in the weeds when you're going through any sort of process. So checking in and making sure and checking in with the people you're in collaboration with, that you're kind of all moving towards a common goal within your small piece of community. And that can be really helpful, I think, to just keep your eyes on the goal and make sure you're moving towards the common goal.
Yeah, I think for if you're putting in any sort of program or change management strategy, if you're not measuring something, you're not going to know that it had an impact. Like you might have a sense, right? You know, oh, my employees seem happier, but you know, if you don't measure it, you don't actually know. And, you know, measuring doesn't have to be complicated, right? You don't need to have fancy statistics and do all the things. You know, you could be putting out engagement surveys, you know, that are 1 or 2 questions. You could be doing exit interviews with people who are leaving to figure out what it was that really made them leave. And I think for like government funded agencies in particular, metrics matter, right? The government is really focused on like time back to employment and time that people are employed. And those matter too. But I think we are doing a disservice when we focus just on employment metrics. Like there's self-esteem, there's self-confidence, there's all sorts of like those kinds of things that we can look at, which you can measure with a self-reported question, or if you wanted to, there's psychometric measures. Like you could do that if you wanted to too. You could just be doing a temperature check in terms of how well you're addressing the diversity needs and cultural needs of your workforce. You know, take one of our questions from our survey and ask your workforce, right? And see how you're doing. You maybe won't like what they come back with, but you know, then we're building our awareness and we're moving forward collaboratively. We're having conversations, right? We're being authentic and genuine. And, you know,
starting point.
Yeah, it is a starting point. Like if employers don't think if employees, if individuals that you employ are not, if they don't get the sense that you even care, you know, they're just going to assume you don't.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think learning to take the feedback is huge, because if you're worried about getting feedback that doesn't align with what you think is going to happen, there's a problem there. And you should be greatly suspicious if you're continuously getting feedback that is like, everything's good, thumbs up. Like that's just not the case. And so I think while checking in and doing those measures, also being aware of like the environment at play that is influencing perhaps those measures. And
be prepared to like do something with what's said.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Don't just do it for the show of it. Like be genuine and I don't know, just be there for what you're doing. Right.
Yeah. And knowing that it doesn't have to be complex. You don't have to bring in an independent recruiter or independent consultant to measure your engagement, or you don't have to do the full scale Gallup poll. Like you can ask one question. Like when we're looking at rural and rural communities, we're looking at small, medium enterprises. So like 1 or 2 questions. Like, I don't know, if you have a yearly strategic plan, add a conversation piece on there about diversity and inclusion. Look around, be curious. Look at an employer or a business person that you admire and see what they're doing and see what might work.
So it's evident in your report that collaboration is critical to success. How do we need to shift the way that these groups work together? What might be more effective ways for collaboration?
We can't ignore the power imbalance, right? So employers are the person offering the employment, right? And they're the person who can take that away. And so you can't ignore the fact that you are, as an employer, put up in a dynamic already. It exists there. So it's hard to level the playing field, but you got to try, right? And so sometimes anonymous stuff is important. You know, that might not work for really small companies. Anything under 10 is probably, you're going to know who's saying what. So be mindful of that as well. But and then government services too, you have to understand the power dynamic there is you're the steward of the funding, right? Like if an individual says to you, oh, I don't think I want to go to do that training or education program, am I now going to be seen as, you know, a reluctant client that shouldn't go for services, right? So these groups, there's going to be a power dynamic in place there. And we have to be cognizant of that when we're starting to have collaboration. And so flattening that out, leveling the playing field, providing some space for anonymity, like where you can, that's really important. Madeleine agrees.
Yeah, I think with collaboration too, it has to be reflective of who is being influenced by the collaboration itself. Because like if there are structures and systems collaborating within each other, like they have to be mindful of the choices they're making and who is being impacted by that. Because a lot of times it can seem easy to just be like, okay, we're doing this with you, woohoo. And then they're like, this surely will work, without collaborating with that other third party that is being involved, right? Because these people are the ones that live with it. These are the ones that actually like need that change to reflect their needs. And if we're not involving them in that collaboration, it's pointless. It's going to go nowhere. And I think that's the biggest thing I could say about the collaboration, and just, again, staying humble, staying open to listening is huge.
I think what your point, Emily, makes me think of is like looking at who's not at the table.
Yeah.
Yes.
So who hasn't been included in the discussions? And often, government funded agencies or programs or projects, like there's lots of discussions from actually like thinking about what it is that we even want to do. So forming a plan and the implementation of that plan, and then actually going and doing it and evaluating it. And so consultation or collaboration at all of the stages, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just the implementation or data gathering, also in the design of the questions, and inviting in perspectives that maybe aren't present within a current workplace or current space. I think, who's not there, who have we not heard from, and who do we need to hear from? And then I guess one step further is, how can we hear them best?
Yeah. I was going to say, genuinely giving them that space to feel like they can share and will be listened to.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just going to say intentionality is hugely important. But I think you can have an intention, you can have the best of intentions and say, this is what we're doing. And this is how it's going to improve things. But you have to have awareness there. There has to be awareness of the landscape and what the people you're trying to benefit are dealing with on the everyday. It's really just echoing what Emily said, but you just have to be curious and hear people and include people.
Well, I think you guys really lived it in this particular project, establishing those relationships with communities that, maybe hadn't been invited in before.
Mm-hmm.
And you saw, how reluctant they were to share.
Mm-hmm.
You're so persistent and kind and curious and just like showing up, right? You guys really showed up for those communities, and, that made the research better than it would have been without it. So key role here.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's a huge piece too, is like, if that collaboration doesn't work the first time around, or people are reluctant to come in, that does not mean to just give up and carry forward how you already were. You have to keep going. You have to stay persistent, right?
And we have to, be flexible, right? Like, the focus groups aren't working. Great. We're just going to come and talk to you and bring you a cookie. And do you have 10 minutes? Great. Perfect. Right? Like, and I think that's the whole walking our talk of it all.
Yeah. Meeting people where they're at.
Yes.
Is huge. We can ask things of people and assess if they're ready for that. If they're not, then we come to you. we take what you have to give.
Yes.
And build from there, because I think that there's always room to build. Meeting people where they're at.
Yes.
Is huge. We can ask things of people and assess if they're ready for that. If they're not, then we come to you. we take what you have to give.
Yes.
And build from there, because I think that there's always room to build.
And you show up time and time again for them, and go to them and ask them what they need, or what you can do for them, or how you can help them.
I think for me, it's showing people that I'm not giving up that easily. I see you, and I feel like I maybe know some of the things that you're dealing with, but I am also coming to learn more, and I want to hear from you. So it's being persistent and coming back and saying, I'm still interested
in you. I'm still interested in you.
In you, and I want to hear from you.
Yeah, and like we value it, right?
We
genuinely value it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, echoing on that, the stories of the research participants were very powerful. What impact can storytelling have on employment outcomes in rural communities?
That's a good one. I think it just makes the future much brighter if we can just take a moment to share these stories, because it's very hard, especially in these rural communities, to feel very alone, feel very like, I don't know, it's easy to make it seem like everybody is doing great except for me. And so the more we can share these, the more we can relate with others and like find these pieces of relational bits that just kind of bring us together as a community, as partnerships all together. And it makes things brighter.
Yeah. Some people that we've spoken to have shared a sense of a loss of community, and a loss of being able to rely on a community, like on their people within their network. A lot of people's network is simply themselves in rural and remote communities.
You know, rural and remote communities traditionally aren't really represented in big like data sets, right? Or like
They're left out of that information.
They're left out of that information. Like when we talk about generalizing these like big data, we're talking about generalizing across a wide variety of communities, and most often it's going to be urban and suburban centers that are the key point of that data. And so to get around that, I think story is the approach. And I think that the stories that we gathered really reflect the rural realities of the people who live there. Like we've done our best to share them in a way that brings those stories to life, in like a data-informed way. But I think when we look at, you know, big surveys of communities, the nuance gets lost in that like haze. And so I think the story approach is particularly important. I also think because it's an Indigenous perspective that it makes sense to adopt an approach that aligns with traditional ways of knowing, inviting them into the conversation in a more meaningful way. I've been doing it for years. It's a great approach.
Yeah, I was going to say.
You heard about this story-based approach? It's great.
I was going to say that, yeah, Indigenous communities thrive on the storytelling. That is how their culture is centered. That is what keeps them going and connected as a community. And I think bringing that in not only like shares their culture and lets them feel more safe and comfortable in the environment, it helps us grow a community on our own. And I think, yeah, that storytelling aspect is like, we should not overlook that. I think it's important.
I picked up the thread. Many of our participants were sharing that a lack of community is huge and a loss of sense of community, and people's networks are often just themselves. And so having us or projects similar to this, people who are in the work of connecting these people, like having their stories shared and saying, I'm going through this and I feel very alone in this, but there are these people who have spoken to these people in this other community that can kind of mirror what's happening in my community. There's a sense of connection there, and if you can see yourself somewhere, there's a little glimmer of hope. Whereas like if it's just you alone, things are really dark. So having people who are able to facilitate things like this and to gather community where it may have been lost, I think is really important.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember too that you don't need to like have these grand big sentences that or like big memoirs even of like here's my story. you can just say things, because we've had so many people along the way tell us like, please make me sound smart in the research. Like, I'm scared to share because I don't sound smart saying this, and then would go off and say the most like eloquent, powerful things. And so we just have to be like, give the space for people to like maybe not use the same words you would use, or maybe approach things with a different way of presenting it, and just be open to those different ways, right? Like, we all have different ways of speaking and sharing, and just having fun with it, being open to that, and just enjoying the ride.
Trust the process.
Absolutely.
It was a real trust the process
Yeah.
kind of moment. But I think like once you got that critical mass and that momentum under you, I think like that is something employers can take with them too. Like, you will get this critical mass and momentum under you if you just like come on in and persistence and not being afraid to misspeak and just being open to hear things on all sorts of different levels and
give people the grace to exist.
So what's one thing you hope changes as a result of this research?
So many things.
You could get that government-funded Uber.
Right.
My last plug for that. No. That was a fabulous idea from somebody.
Please.
Yeah. I think for me, one change I would like to see is a shift in perspective of employers in that they understand their role in facilitating inclusive environments, right? That this is an active, ongoing, critical process and not just a passive thing or a fad. You know, like more and more people are getting diagnosed with mental health issues. The awareness around neurotypical ways of knowing, the Indigenous population, people with mobility issues that are actually able to like exist in the world. Like, you know, like
we're surviving now.
Yeah. But just as the diversity in our school systems has changed, you know, that's going to be the workforce too. And that these people existed before, right? And they exist now. And they are an untapped workforce that can benefit, but you're just going to have to shift a little bit. And so it's challenging employers to find ways to be creative, also recognizing that they need to balance, you know, business realities, because it's more expensive for them to do business now than it was before, especially in rural and remote spaces. And so it's figuring out what they can do. And some of that is just creative solutions, because the wish list items that our participants asked for were not really that complex. Like a flexible work schedule, what? That's simple, right? And, you know, maybe not feasible in all places, but if you've got more than one employee, you can have a flexible work schedule, right? Remote options, time off when you're actually unwell. Like, these don't feel like really big asks and are things that would benefit everybody, right? Everybody.
I love that.
That's what I was going to say.
Sorry.
You can just say ditto.
Ditto.
No, I was going to say, I will say it till I'm blue in the face. Access is for everybody, and it makes things easier for everybody. And if we can see the value that people from diverse groups have to offer, I think that is huge. I think also, I don't know if this is particularly relevant, but I'm on a thread now.
Yeah, go for it. Do it.
Education. I think if you are willing to invest, I think government, if we can find ways to invest in the education of people from underrepresented groups, people with physical disabilities, cognitive disabilities, people in systemic poverty, if we can invest in their education, they will be so motivated to work. If you can just invest like money, time into them, they will not need your services for their whole lives. And they will become self-sufficient and they will learn skills to look after themselves, and we don't need to be in this struggle bus cycle that is so prevalent now. So just seeing the value and the worth that these people have and have always had, and finding ways to implement and support them in their worth is going to have a huge benefit for all of us.
I think that you speak to the potential, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that if we can foster that potential in like ways that actually meet the needs, like a customized, targeted approach, and let people show their value, like they're going to invest back into businesses. Maybe they build businesses, maybe they employ people, you know, maybe they're making more, so they're paying more taxes, right? Like, we don't have to keep people in poverty because it's easier. Easier for who, right? There is a wealth of experience and information in everybody, and opportunity. Like, that's what you're speaking to, is the opportunity. And that's what our participants said too. Like, just give me the opportunity and I'll make it work, right? And I think that people from underrepresented groups have been making it work for so long, you know, and we can just do a little bit better to support them along that journey and still, you know, as an employer, receive benefits from that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me, it's a simple thing. Is just I want to see people have the ability to like take that breath and be themselves, like feel welcome in their community. And that goes for both employers and job seekers, employees, service providers. We all have a heavy plate that we carry. We all have that heavy burden of life, right? And so just like having that chance to just like decompress, I don't know, and just feel like you can be yourself. And we don't all have to like hold hands and sing Kumbaya. But I think it lets us all like flourish and thrive when we can just like feel like that space is there for us to exist. We had one person in particular say like, it's not about being greedy, it's about surviving gracefully. And that has stuck with me. And I think that's what I want to see the most, is just people getting the chance to be who they want to be and being welcome. Because it's a really shitty feeling to not feel welcome in your community.
Yeah.
It sucks.
And it's not even like overtly like, do not serve people. It could be just signs and symbols of spaces.
Exactly right. And so like, I don't know. I'm not asking for a utopia. That's just not going to happen. But like, I don't know, just giving people more grace, more space and grace.
Yeah. A sense of being able to be genuine is, I think, what we all want. And I don't believe that any of us are bad. I don't think we start bad. I think that there are uncomfortable systems that lead to stress and fear. And I think when we're fearful, we react in ways that aren't necessarily the most kind or honorable. But I think if we can just have a sense of the ability to have space to be ourselves and to be genuine, I think that would do a lot in building community and a sense of working towards maybe closer to a utopia.
If only.
Yeah, it makes me think about just being mindful, perhaps, about the unintended consequences of the things that you do and the things that you say and how you operate your business. Because I'd like to agree that, you know, everyone's just doing the best with what they've got on their plate. But I do think there are very real unintended consequences to business decisions that are made. And employers do have to take ownership of that and recognize their role. And I really think there can be business improvements, right? Because this is your customer base. This is your workforce. Like, this is like these people exist. Like, you don't fight so much against these people existing and having the right to work. They want to come work for you. They're motivated. They're able. They're, not trying to be Pollyannish about it. Like, they might need additional supports and services and stuff. And your community service agencies are a great place to go to help figure out how to move forward a little bit better, right? If you're struggling to keep a workforce, well, that workforce likely isn't people who are from the underrepresented groups. So it's not the underrepresented groups that are unmotivated.
Yeah. The more we can go with the flow, the easier it'll get, right? Like, it's simple as that. The more we can like give that space, give these people the opportunities, find systems that work, the easier it becomes for everybody else, including yourself. It just makes the systems easier.
Yeah. And I think also making sure that we provide the appropriate supports and training for the individual, but also the people in the workforce too, right?
Absolutely.
We can't be setting people up for failure in toxic, unsafe places. So it is a multi-pronged approach. There is lots of work to do, but I think it's manageable.
Yeah. Yeah. And just that continuous learning too, right? Because like, you could have a manager who say got their training in the 80s and they are still going at it. Things have changed a lot. So that's, just keep it updated, keep it with the times, do the things.
Do the things.
Okay. So you guys have had a lot of things to share. Do you have any final words for our listeners?
Should go to our website.
www.
Use the resources. Stay tuned for the bonus episodes.
We've tried to be really tangible with the resources that we've created, being mindful that employers have limited time and that individuals are often the focus of many resources that are available and out there. So we hope that what we've pulled together in those spaces will actually give you some tangible tools to set a goal, challenge your biases and assumptions, put a plan in place, make some sort of action, and be sort of thoughtful about how you might evaluate your input and recognize that this is sort of an ongoing process. So it's a bit of an invitation to engage with those resources in a way that fits for your context.
Building off of that, I think doing this work in a way that is manageable, taking it step by step, but also being aware that it's not an excuse to just not do it. I think this work needs to be done. We're at a point where there's not a lot of excuses left to start the work, to not start the work. But finding a way to make it manageable and to attack it in a way that's moving forward, but in a way that's sustainable.
That's hard to top. Just stay hopeful. That's the biggest thing. Because like for us, it was hard at times to not feel like downtrodden or disheartened by it, because it's hard to know what to even just start chipping away at in this big mass of problems, even just outside of like career development and things. But I think, the more we can just like have each other's backs and look after ourselves and those around us, just the better things will become, right? Like, I can't even say this is the start. I think we're kind of in the middle of things, and things will only continue getting better if we keep at it.
Well said, guys.
Thank you, Cassie, Madeleine, and Emily, for joining me today. If folks want to follow you and find out more, where can they do that?
Well, you can go to lifestrategies.ca. That's the company I work for. And you can find out more information about our services, supports. You can connect with me.
You can find myself and Madeleine at freereignassociates.ca and more work that the association is doing.
I came as a visitor to this land, a land that I didn't belong to, but now I feel I do. I was received by people who were settlers too, and others who were here before them. I know we are all building our sense of place and sense of home together as we try to understand our history and heal our past. Vengo como visitante y no sé bien cuál es mi hogar, pero honro y agradezco a los ancestros que estuvieron aquí antes que yo y a los que hoy están aquí y hacen un espacio para que yo pueda caber.
Diversity Disconnect is funded by the Government of Canada. To learn more about the research, visit freereignassociates.ca/diversity-disconnect or check out the links in our show notes. The Diversity Disconnect podcast is hosted by Mallory Tomlinson and produced by Megan to Boekhorst. Our audio engineer is Tim McAlpine. Guests include Cassie Taylor, Madeleine Warkentin, and Emily White. The Diversity Disconnect podcast was developed by Free Reign Associates and Life Strategies.